The morning my mother-in-law handed me a glass of sweet tea and told me her son deserved better, I had already paid that month's mortgage on the house we were sitting in. She smiled when she said it. Warm, practiced, the kind of smile that makes cruelty feel like generosity. She said she'd been thinking about it for a long time. That she loved me, of course she did, but love wasn't always enough. That her son, Daniel, had certain needs. A certain kind of life. She folded her hands in her lap and looked at me like she was doing me a favor by being honest. My name is Rachel. I'm 29 years old. I'm a senior financial analyst at a firm downtown, and for the past 3 years, I had been quietly funding $7,800 every single month to keep my mother-in-law's household running. She did not know that. She had never asked. And until that Tuesday afternoon in her living room, I had never told her. I set down the glass of sweet tea on the coffee table I paid for and nodded slowly. I told her I understood. I told her I appreciated her honesty. And inside, something that had been bending for a very long time finally went completely still. Let me explain how I got here, because the story only makes sense if you understand what I walked into when I married into this family. Daniel and I met at a mutual friend's birthday dinner 3.5 years ago. He was charming and funny, and he made me feel like the most interesting person in the room. We dated for 8 months before he proposed. It was fast, but it felt right, and I was in love in the uncomplicated way you are before you really know someone's family. My mother-in-law, Vivian, lived in a large craftsman-style house in the suburbs that she'd owned since her husband passed away 6 years prior. She was 61, sharp-tongued in the way that gets softened and called direct, and she had 2 children. Daniel and his younger sister, Claire. Claire was 25, engaged to a man named Marcus, and she lived at home with Vivian while they saved up for a wedding. When Daniel and I got married, we moved into Vivian's house temporarily. That was the plan. Temporary. 6 months at most while we saved for a down payment on something of our own. I said yes because I trusted the timeline. I said yes because I thought I understood what I was agreeing to. What I didn't fully understand was that Daniel's income was not what I had assumed. He worked in sales, and his commissions had been inconsistent for the past 2 years. He hadn't told me the full picture, not because he was dishonest exactly, but because he was embarrassed. And I had learned by then that Daniel's pride was something he guarded the way other people guard their savings. The first month we moved in, I covered the mortgage contribution Vivian said we owed as household members. It was $2,400. I didn't think much of it. I was earning well, and it seemed fair. By the 4th month, I was also covering utilities. By the 6th month, I was funding Claire's bridal appointments because Vivian mentioned casually that the wedding account was running short. By month 9, my name was attached to a home equity account that Vivian's accountant had quietly set up for tax efficiency purposes. Vivian had waved it off when I asked about it. It's just paperwork, she said. It doesn't mean anything. I should have asked a lawyer then. I didn't. By the time that Tuesday afternoon arrived, I had been in that house for 2 years and 4 months. I had never missed a payment. I had covered kitchen renovations, a new HVAC system, Claire's rehearsal dinner, a backyard fence Vivian wanted for her garden, and every streaming subscription in the house. I had done it quietly because Daniel asked me to, because it was easier than explaining to his mother where the money actually came from, because I still believed the temporary plan was just delayed, not dead. The 6-month timeline had turned into 28 months. So, when Vivian sat across from me with her sweet tea and her folded hands and told me her son deserved better, I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I picked up my glass, took one slow sip, and asked her what timeline she had in mind. She said she thought sooner was kinder. That if Daniel and I separated now, we could both move on cleanly. That Claire and Marcus would eventually need more space in the house anyway, and it would just be simpler if I found my own apartment. Simpler. That was the word she chose. I drove home from that conversation and sat in my car in the driveway for 11 minutes. I remember counting them on the dashboard clock. I wasn't deciding what to do. I had already decided somewhere, between her 3rd sentence and her 4th. I was just letting myself feel the shape of it before I moved. Then I went inside and called my accountant. That night, I didn't fight with Daniel. I didn't tell him what his mother had said. He came home at 6:30, warmed up leftovers, watched television, and fell asleep before 10. I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop and spent 3 hours reviewing every transfer I had made in the past 28 months. The total, once I had it in front of me, was $218,400. I stared at that number for a long time. Not because it surprised me, but because seeing it written cleanly in a spreadsheet made it real in a way that living through it hadn't. I had been writing that number 1 month at a time, each installment small enough to absorb, large enough to add up to a life I had quietly bankrolled for people who now found me inconvenient. The next morning, I called my lawyer before I called anyone else. Her name was Patricia, and I had used her once before for a contract dispute at work. She was meticulous and unsentimental, which was exactly what I needed. I explained the situation, the contributions, the timeline, the home equity account Vivian's accountant had set up with my name on it. There was a pause on her line, the kind of pause that means a professional is recalibrating their estimate of a situation. She asked me to email her everything I had. I did it from my car in the parking garage before I went up to the office. By noon, she called back. Her voice was measured, but there was something careful in it, the way a doctor sounds when they have news that is worse than expected but better than the worst case. She said the home equity account was more significant than I might have realized. Because my name was listed as a co-applicant for tax documentation purposes, and because I had been making consistent financial contributions to the property that were traceable and documented, I had an arguable legal interest in the home's equity. Not ownership of the house itself, but a legitimate claim against the equity that had been built, in part, by my contributions. She said Vivian's accountant had almost certainly not intended this outcome. Paperwork doesn't mean anything, Vivian had told me. The accountant had apparently agreed. They were both wrong. I thanked Patricia, asked her to begin documenting everything formally, and went upstairs to do my job. I made it through a full 8-hour day without telling a single person what was happening. That was the thing about financial work, the discipline of it transferred. That Friday, Daniel came home and told me his mother had spoken to him. He sat down at the kitchen table with the specific kind of careful expression that men wear when they've been coached on what to say. He said his mother had some concerns. He said it might be a good idea for us to take some space. He said he loved me, but that he thought maybe we needed to figure out what we both really wanted. He said all of this without once looking directly at me. I let him finish. Then I asked him one question. Did you tell her to have that conversation with me, or did she do it on her own? He rubbed the back of his neck. He said they'd talked about it together. Together. His word. I nodded. I told him I needed a few days to think. He looked relieved, which told me everything about what he was expecting from me. He expected tears, or arguments, or pleading. He expected me to fight for the version of our marriage that had been slowly hollowed out for 2 years. He did not expect me to need time to think. He went to bed. I stayed at the kitchen table. I spent the weekend doing 3 things. I found and signed a lease on a furnished apartment on the other side of the city. I forwarded Patricia the paperwork for the home equity account and the full spreadsheet of contributions. And I called my best friend, Jess, who had been telling me for 16 months that something was wrong in this house, and who did not say I told you so even once when I explained what had happened. She offered to help me move. I told her I had already hired movers. She laughed, once, short and surprised. Then she said, "Good." Monday morning, while Daniel was in the shower and Vivian was still asleep, I began packing what was mine. I had one advantage that took years to build. I had always kept my things separate. My furniture had come from my apartment before the marriage. My kitchen equipment, my bookshelves and the books on them, and the art on the bedroom walls. I had moved into this house with my own things, and I had added to it steadily, and I had kept every receipt because I was a financial analyst and keeping receipts was not a choice, it was a reflex. The movers arrived at 9. They were fast and professional, and they did not need to be told twice about anything. By 11:30, the living room was noticeably emptier. The reading chair by the window, gone. The side tables I'd bought at an estate sale, gone. The lamp that Vivian had complimented 3 separate times, gone. Daniel came downstairs at 11:45. He stood at the bottom of the stairs and stared at the living room the way you stare at something your brain refuses to process. "Rachel." His voice was flat. What is this? I'm moving out. I told him we could discuss the details later. But I wanted him to know I was doing this in good faith, and I wasn't taking anything that didn't belong to me. I pulled out a document from my bag, a simple itemized list of everything I was removing with the date I purchased it and the amount I paid. I handed it to him. He looked at the list. He looked at me. He looked at the list again. His face did something complicated that I didn't have the energy to interpret. His mother appeared in the kitchen doorway in her robe. She had clearly just woken up, and she had clearly heard more than she let on because her expression was already hardening into something defensive. She said my name, Sharp, the way she used to call for the dog. I turned to face her. I told her what I had already told Daniel, that I was moving out, that the items being removed were mine, purchased by me, documented, that I appreciated the time I had spent in her home. She said I was being dramatic. She said if I had real concerns, we could talk about them like adults. She said taking furniture was childish. I said I agreed, and that was why I wasn't taking anything that wasn't mine. Every item on the list in Daniel's hand had a receipt in my files going back to the date of purchase. Her eyes narrowed. Then she said the thing I had been waiting for, the thing that made all of this feel exactly as clean as I needed it to feel. She said, "This house isn't yours, Rachel. You don't get to walk in here and walk out with whatever you want." I paused at the door, not for effect, but because I genuinely needed a moment to organize the next sentence. I said, "I know. That's why I'm only taking the things I bought. Patricia will be in touch about the rest." I didn't wait to see her expression change. I walked outside, stood on the front porch, and watched the movers load the last of the boxes into the truck. The morning was cool and bright, and somewhere down the street a neighbor was mowing their lawn, and the sound of it was ordinary and good. My phone buzzed 20 minutes later. Daniel. He was calling, not texting. I let it ring. Then I drove to my new apartment, which was quiet and empty and entirely mine, and I spent the afternoon unpacking books. The first crack appeared 3 days later. The electric bill had been on autopay from an account I had closed the afternoon I left. The gas was the same. The gardening service Vivian had bragged about to her friends at book club had been on a recurring charge to my credit card. The premium streaming subscriptions, the security monitoring service, the grocery delivery account. All of it had been, quietly and without announcement, mine. I hadn't canceled it all at once for dramatic effect. I had simply stopped paying for things that were no longer my responsibility, and the silence of those stopped payments was louder than anything I could have said in that kitchen. Daniel's texts came in clusters. Day 3. The internet is down. Do you know anything about the account? Day 4. Mom says the electricity might be getting shut off. This is getting out of hand. Day 5. Rachel, please just call me. I don't understand what's happening. Day 6. My mom is really upset. This isn't fair. I read them all. I didn't respond to any of them, not because I was punishing anyone, but because Patricia had advised me not to communicate directly while the formal documentation was in process. I forwarded each one to her instead. On the 8th day, Daniel showed up at my apartment. He had found the address through a mutual friend, and I did not hold that against him because I had not exactly hidden it. He stood in my doorway, looking like a man who had not slept in 3 days, which he probably hadn't. I let him in. I made coffee. I sat across from him at my small kitchen table and waited. He said his mother didn't understand why the bills weren't getting paid. He said things were falling behind faster than he'd expected. He said he knew we had problems, but this felt like punishment. I asked him a question. In the 2 years and 4 months I lived in your mother's house, how many of the monthly bills did you personally pay? He opened his mouth, closed it. I asked him again, not unkindly, just clearly. Walk me through the last 6 months. Which accounts were yours? The silence that followed was longer than any argument we'd ever had. I watched him trying to answer the question honestly and finding that he couldn't, because the honest answer was that he didn't know. He had told himself that the household was running fine because it was always running fine, and he had never asked why. I pulled out my laptop. I walked him through the spreadsheet the same way I would have walked a client through a quarterly report. Month by month. Category by category. Mortgage contribution, utilities, renovations. Claire's wedding events, the fence, the HVAC, the appliances. I did not raise my voice. I did not editorialize. I just showed him the numbers. He stared at the screen for a long time. He said, "I didn't know it was this much." I said, "I know you didn't. That's part of what I need you to understand." He asked why I hadn't told him. And this was the question I had been preparing for, the one that mattered more than the money, more than the bills, more than the furniture. I said, "I tried, twice, in the first year. You said it made you feel like less than a husband and you asked me to stop bringing it up. So I stopped bringing it up. And then keeping quiet became the condition for peace, and peace became the condition for staying, and staying became so automatic. I stopped asking whether it was what I actually wanted." He didn't say anything for a while. When he did speak, his voice was different, quieter. He asked what happened now. I told him Patricia would be sending formal documentation this week, that I wasn't looking for a fight, that I wanted a clean and fair resolution, and that what fair looked like would depend on him and his mother's willingness to acknowledge what the past 2 years had actually cost. He asked about the home equity account. I told him to ask his mother about that one. He left an hour later. He looked smaller than he had when he arrived, which wasn't cruelty on my part. It was just the way things look when the full shape of them finally becomes visible. The call from Vivian came 2 days after that. She did not start with pleasantries this time. Her voice was controlled but tight, the way a voice sounds when someone has been practicing staying calm and not quite managing it. She said that Patricia's letter had been received and that she found it deeply unfair. She said she had never intended for that account to imply anything about ownership. She said I was taking advantage of paperwork she had signed in good faith. I said I understood that was how it felt. She said she wanted me to drop the claim. She said if I did that, she would speak to Daniel about giving the marriage another chance. She said she had always liked me, that this wasn't personal. I let the silence sit for a moment. Then I said, "Vivian, 2 weeks ago you sat across from me in your living room and told me your son deserved better than me. I've thought about that sentence every day since. And I want you to know that I believe you were telling me the truth as you understood it. You genuinely believe that. What you didn't know, what I should have told you long before it got to this point, was that for 2 years I was the reason that house was still standing. And I am not saying that to hurt you. I am saying it because you deserve to understand what you actually decided when you decided I wasn't enough." The line was quiet. She said, "Patricia's letter mentioned a number." I said yes. She asked if I was serious about it. I said, "Patricia didn't send letters she wasn't serious about." Another pause. Then she said, "I need some time." I told her she had until the end of the month. I hung up and sat for a moment in the quiet of my apartment, which still smelled faintly of cardboard from all the unpacking, and felt something loosen in my chest that I hadn't realized had been knotted there for years. The following week brought the outcome I had expected, but not the form I had anticipated. Daniel's mother called Patricia directly. She did not call me. She did not involve Daniel in the conversation. At least not initially. She spoke with Patricia for 40 minutes, then called her accountant, then called Patricia again. By the end of the week, she had agreed to a formal settlement that acknowledged my financial contributions and paid out a portion of the home's equity in exchange for me releasing the legal claim. It was not a small number. It was enough to fully fund the down payment on a home of my own. Daniel found out the details through his mother, not through me. And he called that evening with an edge in his voice that was more confusion than anger. He asked if I had been planning this from the beginning. I said no. I said if he believed that, it meant he thought I had been the kind of person all along who planned quietly for betrayal, and if that was his honest assessment of who I was. That told us both everything we needed to know about whether this marriage had ever really worked. He was quiet for a long time. He said he didn't think that. He said he was scared, and he'd said the wrong thing. I told him I believed him. I also told him that scared and wrong wasn't enough anymore. That I had been patient and quiet for 2.5 years, and I was not interested in building a third year on the same foundation. He asked if this was it. If I was done. I said I had already spoken to a family attorney in addition to Patricia. That the paperwork would be coming. He didn't argue. I think part of him had known since the morning he watched the movers in the living room. Maybe longer. The divorce was uncomplicated in the legal sense. We had not been married long enough to entangle our finances beyond what was already being addressed by the settlement. Daniel signed everything in the first round. There were no court appearances, no mediation fights, no contested assets, just forms and dates and the quiet mechanical process of unjoining two lives that had never been as joined as I had thought. Claire called me once. In the middle of all of it, I almost didn't answer. When I did, she was more subdued than I had ever heard her. She said she hadn't known how much I'd contributed to the wedding, her engagement party, the rehearsal dinner catering, the alteration costs for the bridesmaids' dresses she'd picked. She said she'd found the receipts when they were sorting through Vivian's files. I said it was okay. I meant it, mostly. Claire had been careless and entitled, but she hadn't been cruel to me, not on purpose, and there was a difference. She asked if she could pay me back someday. I told her to donate it somewhere instead. She sounded surprised. I told her it was a genuine suggestion, not a dismissal. We didn't speak again after that, but the call meant something to me regardless. It meant that at least one person in that family had looked at what happened and sat with the discomfort of it rather than explaining it away. The settlement closed on a Thursday. I remember because I had lunch by myself afterward at a restaurant I used to avoid because it was too close to Vivian's neighborhood. I ordered something I had been wanting for months and ate it slowly and watched the street outside the window and felt, not triumphant, but clear. The particular clarity that comes when a long noise finally stops. I found the house 6 weeks later. It was smaller than anything Vivian would have considered impressive, a 2-bedroom craftsman on a street with old trees, with a kitchen that needed updating and a back porch that needed repainting and a yard that was entirely mine to do with as I chose. I put in an offer the day I saw it. I signed the papers on a bright Wednesday morning with my own name and my own money and nobody's permission. The agent handed me the keys and said congratulations. I drove to my new house, stood in the empty living room for a while, and let myself feel the full size of the moment. Then I called the moving company to schedule delivery of my things, the furniture I had carried out of Vivian's house, the things I had chosen and paid for and never once apologized for owning. I do not think about that Tuesday afternoon with the sweet tea very often anymore. But when I do, what I remember most clearly is not the anger or the hurt or the long, careful months that followed. What I remember is the silence in my car afterward, the 11 minutes in the driveway, and the feeling of something that had been slowly bending finally going completely still. That stillness saved me. Not the settlement, not the legal claim, not the spreadsheet with its clean and damning numbers. Those things were just consequences of a decision that had already been made, quietly, before any of them existed. The decision was simple. I was going to stop being invisible. I was going to stop funding a life that had decided I was expendable. And I was going to do it without a single moment of performance, without a raised voice, or a slammed door, or a speech they could dismiss as emotional. Because the most powerful thing I ever did in that marriage wasn't staying. It wasn't even leaving. It was the 11 years of compound interest on knowing exactly what I was worth, and finally, for the first time, refusing to let anyone else set that number. My mother-in-law thought she was handing back a problem. She had no idea she was handing back the foundation. And by the time she understood the difference, the only thing left to do was settle up.